All right. Well, I am very excited to introduce to everybody our speaker for tonight. Chris Fisher is best known as the author of a series of best-selling field guides, including Birds of Alberta, one of the most successful made in Alberta books in our province's publishing history. He is regarded as a top voice for all things nature and is a frequent contributor to traditional and social media for Alberta's wildlife and conservation stories. He has written and hosted documentary films and TV series. He currently produces the Birds of Alberta podcast, and he leads wildlife tours throughout the world. Chris Fisher has been communicating with Albertans for decades about our wildlife and on the evolving relationship between nature and culture. And he is delighted with the opportunity to return to the Nature Alberta stage to explore with his friends and colleagues the meaning of our natural world for Albertans. And we are delighted to have him. So, Chris, I will turn things over to you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. Thank you very much to Nature Alberta for putting this on. This is a very different context than when I started doing these sort of talks for Nature Alberta and the Edmonton Natural History Club so many years ago. Reminds me a little bit, I guess, of the time when I was in my 20s and nervously presenting in front of hundreds of people at the auditorium at the old Provincial Museum of Alberta. This is certainly a modern take on that. Yeah, thank you for Nature Alberta for contributing to this. And special thanks really to Nature Alberta for really adapting in the recent decades to become a greater and greater and more effective voice to to all types of naturalists and general nature appreciators in the province of Alberta. If you're not a member, or if you haven't checked the website or their regular magazine, it is of the highest order, and I can't recommend it highly enough. And thanks to for all the people who signed up. It was a delight to look over the names and faces and seeing so many folks who I recognize, at least by name, and friends in the group as well. So I see a few people popping in on the chat. Hopefully it's not an audio issue, but I'm sure Nick will pop in if I am not being heard or seen. You won't see my face. You will just see the slides going by on your screens. So let us begin. This talk, well, Nick approached me many months ago about doing a presentation for Nature Alberta in this context. And I think initially I put together a different presentation, but a few months back when I was in Tanzania, I was thinking more and more about the relationship between the grasslands of Alberta, grassland ecosystem in North America, and the grassland ecosystems of East Africa. I've been fortunate to really fall in love with these grassland systems as a little kid growing up in Lethbridge in the 1970s and 1980s. Not only was I fortunate to kind of live on the outskirts of town as it was then, catching grasshoppers and running through the tame pasture of the outskirts of town and kind of developing a passion for wildlife. Subsequent to my childhood professionally, I've worked a lot through the native grasslands and ecosystems, not only as someone who's a science communicator, but professionally in recent years as an environmental consultant. So not only professionally and personally, I spent a lot of time developing an interest in the natural grasslands of North America in southeastern Alberta. I've been fortunate for the last number of years to lead tours to, what's widely regarded as the greatest savanna ecosystems, grassland ecosystems on the planet, and that is in Eastern Africa. I'll show you images where I tend to go, but it's, kind of that classic savanna landscape that we've seen time and time again on documentary films and everywhere else. Grasslands ecosystems, of course, Are not exclusive to just these two areas in North America and Eastern Africa. Much of Central Asia has them. There's areas in South America and Australia that are dominated by grasslands as well. They're very, very particular, very interesting, and they're wonderful in so many ways, and great for wildlife watching in particular because there's no darn trees or mountains that get in the way of the views. Now, here in North America, this is an image of Western North America. Many of you be familiar with our grasslands, and one of the reasons why we have grasslands, a relatively dry ecosystem, is because the weather systems, as we all know, come in off the Pacific. They capture a lot of the rain and moisture on the West Coast and then create a rain shadow effect out on the plains. So we have a relatively dry ecosystem dominated by grasses to the east of the Front Ranges here in Alberta and all the way through the Great Plains, ranging from Alberta all the way down through to Texas. Now, if we go over to Africa, and I've been fortunate to go in and out of Tanzania. Tanzania is not the only place where wildlife safaris happen, of course. Most famously, they probably already started initially in Kenya, the country immediately to the north of Tanzania, and an ecological cousin to Tanzania, of course. Probably the whole idea of safari tourism kicked off, quite frankly, when if you've watched The Crown or know anything about British royal history, you'll be familiar with the fact that the Queen got word that she was a queen. Her father passed away when she was on safari with Prince Philip at the famous Treehouse Lodge in Kenya. And that aroused a lot of curiosity to what she was doing there and safaring and all that sort of stuff. And through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, safaris, wildlife safaris in particular, have become a on the bucket list of many places. And while Kenya is fantastic, I've not been there yet. South Africa and Botswana are very popular safari places. Perhaps none is more popular than Tanzania. We tend to fly via Amsterdam, from Calgary to Amsterdam, then down to Kilimanjaro Airport, right at the base of that famous mountain. And that is as about a straight line, the shortest straight line that you could draw on the map. It's a long ways over there. Both flights are in excess of 8 hours. You get to East Africa. Now, Tanzania was under colonization, just like most of this area of Africa. It was under English colonization, and it has only formed its own independent country in the latter half of the 20th century, combining Zanzibar, which is on the east coast, the Indian Ocean, and Tanganyika, which we'll visit right away here on the western side. So they combine these two regions politically, but also in name as well, to form Tanzania. Zanzibar is obviously on the Indian Ocean. It's a little bit more Muslim influence, quite exotic in its own very special marine sort of way. Then we go over on the west side. That's the famous Lake Tanganyika, and the even more famous Gombe National Park. Anyone who has followed the career of the late Jane Goodall, Lady Jane Goodall, knew that her chimpanzee study was founded right in this part of Tanzania. To the north, bordering on Kenya and the source of the Nile. Of course, great literary interests in the source of the Nile, running all the way down through North Africa to the Nile Delta in Egypt. That forms kind of the northwest corner of Tanzania. The areas that are very heavily visited after arriving at the base of Mount Kilimanjaro at Kilimanjaro Airport, Mount Kilimanjaro being the highest mountain in Africa. So it's a very, very popular hiking destination. I think I've got a picture of it in here somewhere. So in terms of tourism, when we land in Kilimanjaro Airport, the plane is filled with tourists. I would say half the tourists are going on safari. and the other half are hiking the mountains. And it's a pretty clear distinction on the plane who is who. The younger crowd is usually the ones going on Kilimanjaro. However, it is a fascinating hike for absolutely anyone, and many tours do combine the two as well. Famous natural areas include the Ngorongoro crater, which we'll visit in this presentation. If you watched any documentary films, as I did in the early 80s, they are almost always filmed in the crater itself, which isn't a crater, it's a caldera, but that goes beyond the scope of this presentation. And of course, famously, the most famous national park perhaps in all of Africa, Serengeti National Park, which is just to the west of Ngorongoro crater. And let's just look at a satellite image of it, because we see a similar thing here that we saw in North America, except it's in reverse. You see, thanks to the Coriolis effect, on the south side of the equator, instead of weather systems coming in from the west, they come in from the east. So they come in from the Indian Ocean, moist air from the Indian Ocean slides over, and it catches not on mountains like the Rocky Mountains, but volcanoes, because this area is or has currently been quite geologically active and thrown up all these volcanoes, including Mount Kilimanjaro. So that row of mountains catches a lot of the moist air and creates, on the other side, now on the west side of this range, a rain shadow effect. And you can see it here, a close up of these mountainous areas. They're much greener than one would anticipate when you normally think of Africa. And there are plenty of coffee plantations and agriculture that coincide with the higher elevations on these volcanic mountains. And of course, there's rich soils and pretty good farming. However, it's fairly isolated in terms of the overall geography of this area. It dries out as soon as you get to the bottom of these areas. But volcanoes do play an important role in this part of East Africa. The pulse that you just saw is Kilimanjaro. The highest point there, you can just make out maybe a tiny wisp of white at the very top of Kilimanjaro. There is the last glacier in Africa, just holding on by its nails against the ravages of climate change. And then down here, that green area is centered around the caldera that is now the Ngorongoro crater. So very green in that part of the world. And we tend to visit it in January when it is rainy season, and it does get quite green. The savanna does quite get green. But the feature that I want to point out now is how flat these systems are. You know, a lot of the world is rolly and hilly. Well, not so on the Great Plains of Alberta, although it rolls a little bit. And same is the situation, particularly once you get on the Serengeti Plains and the Dutu Plains. It is very flat, even flatter than what you see in Alberta. Of course, in Alberta, we know that that flatness is due to glaciers having bulldozed that landscape 15 to 20,000 years ago, making it nice and flat in our part of the world. Well, glaciers have not played any role in this part of Africa since it is just a stone's throw from the equator. What made these areas so flat is tying into these volcanoes once again. This area being very volcanically active in the last 10 million years or so, spewed out a lot of ash. That ash would collect downwind, settle, lay flat, and cause a very, very flat terrain, as you see in these images here. Not only very flat, but because of all the volcanic ash, not terribly great to grow a whole big swath of forests. So grasses are the best things in this part of the world. This image is not from the Serengeti. It is from another national park that we visit called Tarangire, just to show that there is a diversity in tree species. And you get that, of course, not only with trees and vegetation in the tropics. The biodiversity in the tropics is much greater than it is in temperate systems, such as where we live. It's just the rules of ecology. You get a whole bunch more insects and birds and everything else living their lives out down in those part of the world than up here. But this presentation is focused so much on the similarities and slight differences. One of them, of course, underlies most of these ecosystems, and it's the grasses. Now, our grasses up here don't grow nearly as tall. You know, the blue gamma grass, the needle and thread grasses that we have and we can enjoy in the natural grasslands in Alberta are fascinating, but rarely grow higher than your ankle. In the African savanna, these savanna grasses will grow, well, up to your chest height. But there is a seasonality to both these species. Obviously, we're just coming out of the harshest season for our native grasses here in Alberta. They, practically die off and then they have to start again from scratch from the ground level after a winter like this. Well, they, of course, don't experience a winter. They do experience drought, but long before the drought ever comes, well, arrives the vast herds of the Great Migration. And the Great Migration includes 2 million wildebeest, zebras, and other types of antelopes. And it is startling. One day the grasses will be as tall as your chest. And once that initial wave of migrants comes through, hundreds of thousands of animals, the size of elk and cattle, they moor right down to the nubs, leaving just the unpalatable things for the subsequent numbers of animals to finish off. And of course, these mammals, the most famous ones are called megafauna, big fauna, big animals. And the biggest ones, the most famous ones, of course, in the world are probably represented on the African ecosystems, but we still have a number of them here in Alberta as well, with bison playing a very central role, of course, in our culture and our mythology. And going along with all this wildlife, it's not just the ungulates that eat all the grass. Of course, going along with that are these predators and the predator prey dynamics. While a little bit more subdued in North America nowadays, there's still signs of it. But boy, you can't avoid it when you go to Africa to see nature tooth and claw, like unlike anywhere else on the planet. There's also, of course, humans, people that have lived for a very, very long time in these areas, and various cultures. And while both North American grasslands and the areas of East Africa were colonized through the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, and the original inhabitants have transformed their cultural traditions somewhat in that time. It is curious that there is a poignant difference when you go to East Africa and see the Maasai culture in particular, one of over 100 different peoples that inhabit this part of the world, but more than any other, they have retained a traditional lifestyle that includes herding, nomadic behavior, and living very much in very traditional mud huts, as you can see on the screen. They do walk around with cell phones, but aside from cell phone technology and going to villages, it is a glimpse very much into how they would have lived many hundreds of years ago. In this part of the world, we have much more industrialization and in industrial cropland and activities, and fragmentation through our grasslands. Much less of it in East Africa. The animals don't hesitate to cross the roads, as you can see here. It is quite a different opportunity when you run into the mighty herds here. This is a part of the Great Migration, which I'll talk about in a little bit while. There's also a great a fossilized history in these parts of the world. Alberta, it's very, very well known. Our paleontology is famous throughout the world, dating back, over 60 million years, whereas the fossil finds in East Africa are not nearly so old, but they are just as important, dating back about 6 million years because the geological activity in the area and the fact that East Africa is being torn away and drifting to the east. It's creating this great rift valley, and it is very similar to the Badlands of North America because the exposed soil, and that is where Lewis and Mary Leakey famously found some of the very first hominid fossils, which led to a better understanding of human history, which likely dates back to this very, very region of the world, which is very exciting when you do experience it. Now, of course, it's not just that, it's just an immensely diverse area. So, if you were interested in butterflies, you could have an incredible journey. Dung beetles in the thousands. They're like grasshoppers in August on the prairie roads of Alberta. You can't avoid running them over. Well, it's the same thing with dung beetles after a couple 100,000 wildebeest have left their deposits on the plains. A tremendously interesting area for its tropical diversity. One of the really interesting things about East Africa that has even over our region in Africa is that the main characters are so very well known. In fact, if I were to look back at the toys that I began to play with, the animal toys that I began to play with as a child, that my parents bought me, and the toys that I bought my own children, well, you'd look at them, they'd be lions and rhinoceros and zebras. They probably wouldn't be the ones that we have here. The main characters of Africa are the most famous wildlife on the planet. Most of the tours refer to the big five. I never do because I can't limit myself to just five of these amazing things. Amazing opportunities to spend time with lions. Lions so close that they literally rest in the shade of your safari vehicle. Experiencing wildlife in these areas is usually done in Toyota Land Cruisers and safari vehicles. There are limited opportunities to walk around and hike, and with lions and leopards and cheetahs and so many other things, you're quite happy to stay in your safari vehicles, but are amazed that the wildlife have adapted, at least in the national parks, due to generation and generation after that of acclimatization to these animals, that they are so comfortable, and in fact in some cases actually use the vehicles as blinds or shields when they do stalk prey. So to be close to lions is an amazing thing, and better yet, when lying in your tent camps and hearing them with their distinctive roars off in the distance, it tingles you, and it makes you think that yes, you do have DNA that runs all the way back to these very same plains of East Africa, because no one who hears that can't be a little bit struck in their very deep core by the magnanimity of lions, but also large predators like cheetahs, my personal favorite. My goodness, the sleek, wonderful cheetahs that hunt smaller prey and do it with exceptional speed, unlike the power of a pride of lions. Another very powerful cat would be, of course, a leopard. Hangs out in trees mostly when you do see them, either feeding or resting, kind of staying away from the lions that kind of dominate the low areas. Although lions can climb trees a little bit, they don't do it quite as well as leopards. You don't find the leopards quite as often, but my goodness, to spend time with a leopard, like on this photo here, it's quite a peaceful and mesmerizing opportunity. Usually not far from the leopard in a tree is the remains of its meal hanging listlessly in a tree. A limp body of a young wildebeest or a impala or something like that joins them as well. You can't help but see elephants Elephants being, of course, a great story of poaching, particularly in the 60s and the 70s. That was the main theme for so many of the documentary films that I grew up watching. It is so wonderful now to see herds and to see so many young elephants, baby elephants. And of course, elephants are legendary for their capacity to be maternal, to provide great extended care to their babies, and their ability to be social. There's a lot going on in elephant herds when you spend time with them. And we only get half of it, for we're only looking at the visual cues. If we were to be able to hear their deep vocal communications, roaring communications, there'd be a whole other language there. Of course, giraffes. I mean, just incredible things. You know, you go to the Calgary Zoo, you see a couple of giraffes, you stare at them for many, many minutes, and to see them running free over the savannah, standing overlooking your safari vehicle, is quite another thing. And they're relatively common in these protected areas, and even outside of some of the protected areas, they are found. Hippopotamus, again, these iconic megafauna, all these things bigger than anything that we have here in the province of Alberta, mostly confined to water holes and wet areas where you can go and easily see them, but occasionally in the early morning hours, you see them coming back from feeding, where they feed mostly on land at night. And then, you know, my absolute favorite, I mean, who wouldn't love the sight of a magnificent black rhino like this? There's also white rhinos, much more endangered in this part of East Africa, but black rhino is very endangered. You can see the ears on this particular individual have punches taken out to identify this particular individual in the Ngorongoro crater. Great place for them is the crater. Like its name implies, it is fully surrounded by I think it's a 2,000 foot, 1,000 meter wall, volcanic wall. So it was one of the earliest areas, particularly in the poaching period, that was easy to protect from poaching. And of course, like elephants, rhinos were and continue to be a great target for poachers. But the crater has allowed a very healthy population of about 50 black rhinos to flourish in this area. And just recently, they've introduced a very small population of white rhinos, not indigenous to the area, but owing to the great habitat and protection of the area, you have that as well. So turning to North America, well, you know, currently on the landscape, we do have some megafauna. We have some big things that we all have an opportunity to enjoy. Of course, we have plains bison. We have a few places in Alberta where they run free, and in, of course, Grasslands National Park in Saskatchewan, you get a nice sense of herds of bison moving together. A few more large, unfenced herds in the United States. This photo from Yellowstone National Park, but also, you know, places like Cutler and other buffalo preserves that they have through the Great Plains. It's a good sense to get what the impression of bison are on the landscape. Of course, we have large herds of elk moving back onto the Great Plains of Alberta. When I began my naturing forays in this province, you were hard pressed to see any elk on the Great Plains of Alberta, and now it is not unusual to see them just about anywhere in the province, all the way from the south of the Cypress Hills, all the way up to the Lloydminster area. These two I photographed in Suffield, the military base, the Suffield block. I was fortunate to do some work in there. And while we do see elk very regularly in the mountain parks, I did like the look of them, just totally belonging in a native grassland environment. And of course, we have pronghorn. Pronghorn, perhaps the greatest icon of the native grasslands of North America that is still present and present in big numbers. While 100 years ago, their numbers were down in the entirety of North America, down to about 3,000 individuals. Well, today, this winter on a good drive in and around Medicine Hat, you could be lucky to see that many individuals in one afternoon alone. So it's nice that they've come back and they're very intriguing and, of course, very unique to this particular part of the world. And let us not forget that we have predators on this landscape up until a short time ago, grizzly bears, starting to actually start to recolonize some areas of Alberta grasslands. The Milk River Ridge in Alberta is starting to get some records of grizzlies, and there's a possibility that they will continue to expand. Remember that it was the Lewis and Clark expedition that first found grizzly and recorded grizzly for scientific reasons. And that was in an area of eastern Montana called Poplar Creek. And if you were to draw a line north of Poplar Creek, you'd run into Grassland National Park in Saskatchewan. So they were found all the way out on the grasslands, and it is really only us that's keeping them from returning to the grasslands to this day. Holds true for wolves. This is the only photograph that is not mine in the entire presentation, because I've not yet seen a wolf in Alberta's grasslands. I believe this photo is from the Yellowstone. And while I've seen them in Yellowstone, I've not got that great of a photo of them. So let's talk about some uniquely African families and African group of species that we don't have in Alberta. First and foremost, while we have a great bunch of birds, we don't have the big birds. And only Africa has ostriches, but ostriches, as you will probably know, are closely related to the emus of Australia and the rheas of South America. And this all dates back to the time when those three continents were joined. And when they were joined, that was during the early evolutionary period of these birds here. So if Alberta would have happened to be joined in with the rest of them, who knows? We might have had a giant bird walking around brooks, but we don't have that. So it's uniquely there. We don't have any pigs either. Well, I guess there's introduced wild boar in parts of northern Alberta that are causing mayhem, but we don't have any really wild pigs in North America that are native. Africa has warthogs, and they're jolly and fun to look at. Similar, we don't have any flamingos in the North American continent, save for the extreme southern states around the Gulf of Mexico. But in areas of Central Africa where there is water, you get large colonies of flamingos, not only greater flamingos, but lesser flamingos as well. As you might imagine, graders are about twice the size as the lesser flamingos. And, I don't know if there's another bird that has become as popularized and iconic anywhere in the world. And it kind of makes you scratch your head a little bit when you're sitting at the edge of quite frankly, a stinky soda lake, as they call them, because there's so many minerals in the waters. And to think that somehow these birds have somehow appeared on the front lawns around the world of retirees trying to capture summer pleasantness. It's quite unusual indeed. A whole bunch of birds. Of course, the diversity of Tanzania is greater than the entire country of Canada. So you end up with some just spectacular little birds, a family of birds called the Waidas, which I very much enjoy, mostly because they have this ridiculously long tail. Looking at the magpies in my backyard today, they've got a long tail, but while it's impressive here on the Great Plains, it doesn't hold a tail feather to the Waidas of Eastern Africa. Same holds true for the vibrance of some of the birds, these bishop birds, which are really a common bird of marshes. Just spectacular with their vibrant scarlet plumage. Really neat little bee eaters. There's European bee eaters as well. These are fly catching birds that, as their name rightly implies, they eat not only bees, but whatever they can catch on the wing. And really, one of my favorite things upon my first visit was to get a sense of these weaver finches. And in total, there's over 20 species, and they all kind of follow a similar body plan. You can see these are two individual species here, two different species. If you look close, one has a pale eye, one has a red eye, one has a red cap, one has a black cap. And it's those combinations of ID marks that you look for in identifying the individual species, but also each species seems to have their own architectural flair. You can see the difference between the nest structure of these two birds. And if I were to post another dozen species of weaver finches hanging upside down on their nests, you would see that each of their nests look a little bit different. You know, a combination of the entry point and the nesting material, and whether they're solitary or group nesters, all these sort of things are very, very important to distinguish them, and very interesting to explore as weaver finches. Weaver finches are just really one of my favorites as well. I'm just going to turn up my volume just a little bit here. I'm just going to turn it up just a little bit, so hopefully that helps you guys out a little bit. Also, of course, because we are in such a tropical place, we are in the presence of monkeys. We talked about Jane Goodall, and chimpanzees, typically on a standard wildlife safari. We don't tend to go to the chimpanzee areas, but there's still a couple of species of monkeys that are present. Probably the most common one is this cute little vervet monkey, and then the not so cute olive baboon. Baboons are pretty gruff looking, pretty aggressive looking. They move around in large troops, and you don't want to be caught in the back street of Moshi when a bunch of baboons come out of the bar at night. They're a pretty grisly group of animals. But keep in mind, there's other monkeys associated with the highlands. The tropical areas of these areas have beautiful colobus monkeys, and not too far away from Tanzania, of course, the mountains of Rwanda and Uganda have the famous gorillas, and many people will go visit those after an African safari. There are storks, beautiful, attractive storks. We don't have storks in Alberta, things like yellow-bill and saddle-bill storks, just gorgeous storks. But for every gorgeous stork, you also have a super ugly stork, and that's the classic marabou stork, a fascinating snake eating specialist called the secretary bird. We simply don't have enough snakes for a raptor to be completely dedicated to eating snakes. And if you look at its long legs, well, that's exactly what it uses, those legs to grab and seize snakes well away from its vital organs. The cute little deer, and we're going to get into a whole bunch of antelope and deer species in a moment here, but one of my favorites is the Klipspringer. Oh, I spelt it wrong. It's the Klipspringer. It's K-L-I instead of K-I-L. Just a tiny little deer that always hangs out in rocks, always on its tippy toes. Beautiful things. There's so many large animals. There are actually birds that specialize on only eating the ticks and parasites that occur on them, and those are the wonderful oxpeckers. There's a whole bunch of cuckoos, whether they're colorful or they're not colorful. There's even hornbills, which is a family of birds that is pretty much restricted to Africa and Asia, but just terribly interesting, exotic, always with these massive bills. They're either hanging out in trees or this large ground hornbill that you can see with that large red face. Just a very, very interesting group of birds. And then finally, of course, probably large mammals, not the largest mammals, but a series of hoofed mammals that are in the antelope family. And I know many Albertans still persist in calling our pronghorn antelope. Pronghorns are their own thing, so they should be celebrated as their very own thing. You know, it's they've got their own branch on a family tree. They are not an antelope, and when you visit Africa, boy, you get a sense of really the diversity of antelopes, because boy, every day brings another type of antelope. There's tiny gazelles. These are very fast, very small, a little bit larger than a Great Dane dog, Thompson and Grant's gazelles. Thompsons are the ones that always seem to be in chases by cheetahs. They're very, very fast. The impala, the great leaper of the savannah, usually preferring more wooded environments, as does the tiny, tiny dik-dik. Dik-dik is about the size of my Australian shepherd, a very, very small antelope. And then on the other side is the eland, a cow-sized antelope, but don't let its size deceive you. The eland is as athletic as the rest. Our guides tell stories of these birds, the size of heifers, leaping over the hoods of their land cruisers, which are, 4 or 5 feet high and 6, 7 feet across. These are impressive, impressive animals that can get away from all sorts of things. Whole bunch of bucks. Here are $4, $5, bush bucks, reed bucks, steam bucks, water bucks. Everywhere you turn, there's just these different looking things. And of course, perhaps the ungulate that stirs the drink of the Serengeti in particular, because it is the lead animal in the Great Migration. 1.5 to 2 million individuals walking around in a counterclockwise direction, from Kenya in the north all the way down to the South Serengeti and Ndutu, where we catch them in January. Massive, massive herds that just mow down the grass. But of course, these are having babies, and just such an important terrestrial ecological component. There certainly is no other terrestrial ungulate that has as great an impression on the landscape. It is a wildebeest ecosystem. If you had to narrow it down to just one animal, this Serengeti in particular is all about the wildebeest. Closely relative of it, however, is the hartebeest, and we can go just on and on and on. One of the things that I like most about going to Africa, or traveling anywhere in the world, Nick was talking about visiting Costa Rica, is that when you do travel, they're ecological cousins of our favorite mammals and birds, and even our amphibians and reptiles that we grow accustomed to, develop a relationship here in Alberta. And then when you travel, you see them there. They're not quite the same. They're cousins, but they're kind of doing the same thing. So, of course, we're very familiar with the coyotes in Alberta, and there's another canis, another canid. It is called the African wolf. It used to be called the silver-backed jackal. It is right about the same size, and it slinks along very much like our coyotes, although it probably keeps one eye open when it does sleep, because while our coyotes no longer have grizzlies and wolves to deal with, well, these little guys, there's always a pack of lions or hyenas around. They have cranes. Cranes in Africa, the most spectacular crane in the world, the most ornate crane in the world. But close your eyes and listen to them fly overhead. They sound pretty much like the sandhill cranes that make their way in and through Alberta, nesting in the foothills in the northern part of the province, but of course flying over each and every one of our homes at some point in the year. They're on their way. They're coming in about a month's time. Of course, we have bison. Large bison in the genus Bos, B-O-S, and wouldn't you know it, the namesake, quite frankly, of buffalo. The reason people would call our bison buffalo is because of these guys here, the Cape buffalo, a common herding animal on the plains of East Africa, wallowing in mud, very nasty. But even as formidable as this animal does appear, they are preyed upon by packs of lions. It's not just mammals that have close relatives in Alberta. You know, that tawny eagle looks a heck of a lot like a golden eagle, and you wouldn't be wrong. Tawny eagles are in the same genus as our golden eagle. The martial eagle is in another genus, a tropical genus altogether. Of course, we're familiar with woodpeckers, and within the woodpecker order, the big group of woodpeckers, here in North America, we really only get woodpeckers. But when you go visit the tropics, you, of course, get woodpeckers, but you also get crazy things like barbets, which, kind of are a woodpecker, but spend a little bit more time in the ground, and they're very comical and approachable, and they don't do quite as much drilling as the classic woodpecker, but they're a woodpecker relative nonetheless. There's pelicans, looking very similar to our white pelicans, the African pelican. There's nightjars, very similar to our caiman nighthawks, of course. There's all sort of herons and egrets. The black-headed heron looks very similar to the great blue heron, which is also on its way. It'll probably be showing up. First reports should be in probably southern Alberta. Anyone on the talk here from Lethbridge, keep your eyes open. You'll be the first to call in the great blue herons as they cross the Montana border in a week's time or not. So those of you who are familiar with our Alberta shorebirds will instantly recognize these African shorebirds. They look a tiny bit different, but one is an avocet and the other is a black-winged stilt. And in Africa, well, these ones are doing the exact same things that our Alberta counterparts are doing. And one of the greatest analogies are the shrikes. We love our shrikes in Alberta. The summer loggerhead shrike, recovering quite well, actually, as you drive through rural Alberta. Keep your eye out for shrubs and native areas. You'll see a little bird looking very similar to the grayback shrike on the left side of your screen. But in Africa, there's just so many more grasshoppers, so many more mice, so many more prey items. So there's dozens of shrikes. There's so many shrikes, they don't even use the word shrike. All the time they use fiscals and these other words to describe this family of small predatory songbirds. Just very interesting. And starlings here in Alberta, of course, are introduced. They come from the old world. And it's too bad they had to introduce perhaps the ugliest one of them all. I mean, just imagine if they would have chosen wisely and introduced a superb starling. And that's its actual name, superb starling. It is very well named because it is a starling that is certainly superb in its plumage. Now, we lamented a little bit that much of our megafauna here in North America can't compete with the megafauna of East Africa. But if we only go back a couple tens of thousands of years, we would have been doing much, much better. North America has experienced, as many other places of the world, a big drop off in large mammals in particular since the Pleistocene. The last 10,000 years or so. So while Africa has zebras now, well, we used to have a whole bunch of wild horses. They all went extinct 10 to 12,000 years ago. There are, of course, North American lions right here in Calgary. There would have been North American lions preying on those horses and many other things. And they were just as formidable, even more so than the African lions that you hear at night. Even a Smilodon, which is a saber-toothed lion that occurred a little bit south of Alberta 10 to 12,000 years ago. Of course, we also had elephants roaming the grasslands of the Great Plains as little as 10,000 years ago. Mastodons were in the area. So we did have this grassland megafauna ecosystem that could easily rival what we find in Africa today. And it makes you look at Alberta just a little bit differently. We even had a cat called a homotherium, which analogous to a spotted hyena with the long front legs, kind of the hunched back, kind of a do-it-all sort of predator that is not to be messed with at all. And even my favorite cheetah. Can you imagine this, going out to Medicine Hat or Many Berries and seeing a cheetah chase down pronghorn antelope? And that is the reason why pronghorns are the fastest land mammal on the world today, is because the myrocynonyx kept them speedy. Obviously went extinct 10 to 12,000 years ago, but the speed legacy of these animals still lives through in the DNA of pronghorns and even white-tailed jackrabbits that live up and down my street and your street. They are super speedy. There's nothing that's going to catch them that's around today, but that wasn't the case 10,000 years ago. Lastly, I just want to talk about these interesting group of species. There's not many of them that, while they look the same, they're completely unrelated. And they kind of do the exact same thing. Evolution has converged in these two areas independently and evolved similar species. Vultures are really good examples of it. We thought for many years our North American vultures were related to the great vultures of Africa, like all these here. There's a vulture for every occasion. If you want to rip through the flesh, you're one vulture. If you want to rip apart a thigh bone, there's another. If you're just picking at the remains of the ribs, there's another one. But these vultures, while they look superficially and do superficially the same thing as our turkey vultures and black vultures here in North America, they are distantly related indeed. If you go to the rocky areas, well, you'll see little rock hyraxes in the very same way that you see pikas or even marmots in parts of Alberta. Marmots are rodents, and hyraxes, well, their closest relatives are in fact elephants. And don't have enough time to get into the details of that one. While we have hummingbirds here in North America and throughout the world, people are envious of our hummingbirds. I'm kind of envious of their sunbirds. The sunbird on the left, speaking of good names, that's called the beautiful or gorgeous sunbird. Just imagine that being in the field guides here. What an exceptional names. And here's my favorite analogy here. We, of course, are very familiar with red-winged blackbirds. It's one of the most commonly seen birds anywhere in the Great Plains. In the wetlands of Alberta, there is a look-alike in Africa called a long-tailed widowbird. The males even are all black with a red epaulette. They even sit up high in tall reeds, and they squawk and they make a much annoyingness to all the creatures that come around. Because just like the red-winged blackbird, these widowbirds are in fact polygynous. So they have the same breeding strategy, not just the same looks. So there is something about a wetland complex that tweaks evolution in the exact same directions because it has done it independently in two separate areas. Fascinating to see these birds on opposite sides of the globes doing the exact same things, even though they're terribly distantly related. Not only that, you have a look in North America for meadowlarks. We're all very familiar with meadowlarks, the song of the meadowlark, but also it appearing in the grassland regions of the province. Well, there's look-alike birds there that aren't meadowlarks. They're actually pipits and lawn claws. Bird on the left is not a western meadowlark. It is, in fact, a longclaw. Looks exactly like, distantly related, but again, another example of an ecosystem, similar ecosystems having evolutionary and adaptive impacts that allowed the physical appearance to match world away. So I'm just going to finish off here by showing just a few video recordings of these interactions that I've had in Africa in particular. Starting off here just with two twin images of what the Great Migration looks like. This is coming off Nabi Hill in the Serengeti, looking over it and seeing a spill of wildebeest from horizon to horizon, likely a million individuals of wildebeest and zebra moving together, literally pouring out over the grassland, moving like an oil spill, consuming the grasses in front of it. And you can't help but think that similar sights like that were found in parts of Alberta. I mean, you get to see so many lions in this part of the world that, quite frankly, you get sick of them. You never get sick of leopards. They are absolutely spectacular and individual, and it's always so many things to see. And to have an opportunity to film and experience cheetahs in an intimate way is one of the great thrills of any wilderness watcher as well. It's not only the big cats here in the Ngorongoro crater. We got a chance to spend a little bit of time with this very same rhino. You can see a little bit of ointment on the side of its body. One of the very few animals that gets veterinary care because they are so endangered. Everything else, of course, is pretty much left to nature. But what a regal animal. And of course, historically, there were woolly rhinos in Beringia in the northern areas of North America, and to have the opportunity to actually experience and to see hunting and predation. While we know this happens in North America, it typically is done outside of our view, but to have an opportunity down here in Nundutu in particular, where during certain seasons, you're not restricted to staying on the roads. You can go off road and follow these animals as they interact on the hunt and everything else. These big cats are not so different in many ways to the house cats that we have roaming around. Lions in particular are social and affectionate with one another. They seem to have certain interactions. This is an example of, yes, lions can climb trees. These two individuals were on the lookout for a male lion that was on the move. They were concerned about that, but it's not all death. There is life as well. To have opportunities, particularly at the time of year that we go, the great bounty of life of zebras and wildebeest giving birth is quite a magic thing to behold as well. More cheetahs, of course, not only on the hunt, but on occasion coming together. And these are three individual brothers, quite famous in due to nice and fat and well fed at this time of year, and just to see them somewhat affectionate and interacting with one another is always a thrill to experience that. And lastly, some elephants. To see a young elephant perhaps playing in the mud for the very, very first time. It's hard not to anthropomorphize on the joy that elephants have in mud bathing, and to vicariously experience a little bit, but to spend time with elephants, and on their own terms. In the wild, going about the landscape as they do, plowing down trees, constantly consuming food and vegetation, and really appreciating the size of animals, and that we at one time would have had animals of this size, of this magnitude, of this grandeur in the Alberta ecosystems that we are so familiar with, is just really one of the great treats. And really, perhaps the greatest thrill of travel is always not only looking out and learning about new places, but East Africa in particular has allowed me to learn and appreciate and love our own Alberta grasslands just about a little bit better as well. All right. Thank you very much for your participation. I went 2 minutes late. I hope you will forgive me. I will stop sharing the screen now and hand it over to Nick.